Originally what I was going to do for this presentation was to talk about, the nutritional development of heifers from basically weaning to breeding and then from breeding to calving. But, I've just had a deluge of phone calls in my office and coming from producers, coming from other extension livestock specialists. We've seen a big change in the feed markets over the last 90 days. Corn was $3 a bushel on August 1st. Today it's selling, at least on the futures market, we're at 480. Okay. And we've seen a significant escalation of other commodity feed prices follow the trend with corn. And so thus after checking that it was all right with Dr. Thomas, I went ahead and sort of kind of changed my topic a little bit to sort of emphasize more what the downstream impacts of that expensive feed might be for the development of heifers. Okay. So heifer development all goes back to this idea that we're going to get these prepubertal heifers to a point where they are reproductively functional and where they're going to potentially become our future females or somebody else's future females for that matter. And nutrition plays an important component in signaling puberty and, the beginning of the estrus cycle. And this is some classic work that was done in Miles City, Montana back in the early 1970s by Bob Short and Bob Bellows. And all it shows here is the effect of the amount of feed. So they essentially programmed or developed these rations where these heifers would gain either half a pound or a pound and a half a day, and wanted to know what the implications of developing heifers at that rate for those days for the 180-day development period would be. And so you'll notice here that the heifers that were developed on a high plane of nutrition, they reached their first estrus about 56 days sooner than those that were on the low plane of nutrition. Now, something that might stick out to you all on this slide, I know it sure did to me when I was putting it up here, is notice the difference of the weight of these heifers at first estrus relative to our cattle today. These were Hereford, small framed, a completely different type of cattle than what we make today. So don't read anything into those heifers expressing estrus at a much smaller weight than what we would see today. More importantly, though, as you go along with this, the greater plane of nutrition that these animals were put on, the more of them that conceived within 20 days of the beginning of the onset of the breeding season, which, I don't want to steal Dr. Thomas's thunder or anything, is really a metric that a lot of us on the extension side are starting to put emphasis on in terms of developing and building a better and more resilient cow herd in the long run, trying to get as many females bred on the front end of a breeding season as possible. And you'll notice that the overall conception rate, the low plane of nutrition, only about half of them got bred, whereas when we got into the medium and into the high, we got over 85% conception. Okay. And so what that evolved into was a discussion about this concept of target weight. And so the target weight is the weight at which that we presume a majority of those heifers would be reproductively functional. Now, since the early groundbreaking work that was done by Dr. Short and Dr. Bellows came out, we've had this debate about the appropriate target weight to develop heifers to. Now, when we say target weight, we express that as a percentage of their mature weight. Okay, and typically we're going to be somewhere in our discussions about it, we're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 65% of their mature body weight at breeding. Okay. So that raises the question of how aggressively should we be feeding these heifers to get them to a point where they're reach that target weight at breeding. Now, there's a little more nuance to that conversation, though, because despite our best efforts to encourage people not to raise giant cows, we have a lot of big cows today across the country. And it's not just a symptom of one state versus the other, one breed versus another. We have long been marketed to the benefits of increasing, the size of our animals for sake of increasing, beef production for sake of increasing rate of gain, all of these metrics that apply more into the feedlot setting. And so when we set these target weights, we can't necessarily just assume, oh, I've got a 1,000-pound cow at home and I need to get her to 650 to breed. Okay. And realistically, even more so today, I would say that we're increasingly getting to a point where, you know, even a 1,200-pound cow assumption, unless the producer is conspicuously and diligently selecting for a more moderate animal, you know, a 1,200-pound cow is even becoming less common than it once was. You'll notice, so that means that our target weight estimates is, you know, if our heifers are weighing 750 pounds when we breed them and we have a 1,400-pound cow, we're below our target weight threshold. You know, if you're running 1,400-pound mature cows, to even be on the scale, you need to be somewhere in the 800 to 850 pound at breeding range. And those numbers could get even more extreme if you are particularly focused on, you know, growth genetics, large cows, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, John Hall wrote an article back in 2013 that I thought did a really nice job of framing the discussion of 55 versus 65 that a lot of reproductive physiologists and nutritionists and everybody else have had. And, you know, the question about which one is appropriate is there's not really a right answer to it. I have an opinion, but I don't have a fact. And I think that my opinion is based on some of these bullet points up here. You know, the 65% target weight is probably more appropriate for an operation that's either based on purebred seed stock, later maturing cows, larger frame cows, small herds where you have fewer females to develop in the first place, plentiful forage resources, you know, high value for these replacement females, and also maybe perhaps the limited marketing of open females. So a system that's a bit more intensively managed. Now, on the other hand, the 55% advocates would be targeting, you know, earlier maturing cattle that are crossbred for moderate frame cows, large herds, limited forage resources, you know, average replacement heifer value, meaning that it's easy to acquire replacement heifers elsewhere, but also importantly, the ample marketing of open heifers. And so, you know, when you run a system like that where you are able to market open heifers, you know, easily, you can keep more heifers back. And as long as you keep your development costs in check, hypothetically, those open females are profitable feeder animals still that could be marketed. Okay. So let's put this heifer development in context and in timeline. And so, you know, if you think about a springborn calf that's weaned in October and you're going to breed, say, in April to calve in February as a 2-year-old, you're going to have about 210 days or about 7 months to get that heifer from their weaning weight to their target weight appropriate for breeding. Now, if you're taking a 500-pound heifer and you're making her an 800-pound heifer, you've essentially got, you know, 300 pounds to put on those animals in about a 7-month period, or about 200 days. And so, you know, 300 divided by 200, that's about a 1.6 pound average daily gain. And to get a 1.6 pound average daily gain, that's going to take a diet that's approximately 65% TDN, total digestible nutrients. This is a proxy for energy that nutritionists use when formulating diets, and also a diet that contains greater than 12.5% crude protein to meet those protein requirements. Next. Okay. So the timeline of this process, you know, knowing your target weight, subtracting your current weight. And we had that discussion already about what the target weight should really be and how that's dependent upon the size of the cows within your herd. So we've got an example here. Like I said, we've got a 500-pound heifer weaned October 1, needs to weigh 800 in April, 300 pounds in 180 days, roughly 1.6 pounds per day. Now, the last comment that I'll make about this is that in an ideal situation, these heifers are going to be put on a steady incline in terms of plane of nutrition. There's been research that's done on, do we start them off slow and where they're gaining at a modest rate early in the development period, and that rate of gain increases as we get later on into the development period, versus let's start them off fast and coast into the finish versus, you know, steady. And the data would bear out that the last thing we want to do is to have those heifers essentially coasting into the finish. If we develop them hard early and then get them to where, you know, we are meeting maintenance energy requirements, or perhaps they're even slightly losing weight at the time of breeding, that can have some negative impacts on reproductive function. So, you know, going back to the parable of the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady is going to win this race in terms of developing heifers successfully. Okay. Now, one important piece to think about when we talk about heifer development that I don't know that everybody appreciates as much as they should. Our body prioritizes the use of nutrients, not just our bodies, all living creatures' body prioritize the usage of nutrients based on this hierarchy. And I pulled this hierarchy out of the recent nutrient requirements for beef cattle textbook that came out. Essentially, the way to read this is there's 9 functions on here that the body would use nutrients for. The body is going to use any nutrients that it receives to meet the top category first. And once it has met that requirement, then if there are additional nutrients left over, it will use those nutrients for that second category. Okay, so the basic function that a body's going to use nutrients for is basal metabolism for primary body functions. The ability to gather food and growth are going to be the next 2 on the list. Basic energy reserves are 4th, maintenance of pregnancy 5th, lactation 6th, moderate energy reserves 7th, and then we get to number 8. Number 8, you know, for most of y'all that are sitting here in the audience today listening to this presentation, you're here to learn about heifer development, about successfully onboarding replacement heifers into your cow herd or into somebody else's cow herd. But I'm here to tell you that the plane of nutrition matters, and we have to grow these animals because if you'll notice, the initiation of pregnancy and successful estrus cycles are near the bottom of the nutrient partitioning hierarchy. An animal is only going to get pregnant if all of those other nutrient requirements are met before before pregnancy. Okay. So now to shift gears a little bit and to get back into, you know, what I started off talking about. So we've seen some real changes in the corn market in the last 90 to 120 days. And that's had some impacts on our feed prices. Go ahead. Okay, so I borrowed this slide from Wesley Tucker. He's a field specialist in ag business based out of Bolivar. If y'all don't know him, you should. He's an outstanding economist. And what I've got here is corn usage in 2020, and this is estimated by the USDA. And so the numbers might look a little bit nebulous to you, but so across the bottom, we've got production. So that's how much corn we made, and that's in millions of bushels. The domestic use of, exports, and then our ending stocks. Now, you'll notice that our y-axis is both positive and negative. What this says is that the USDA estimated our production, our 2020 corn production, down by 770 million bushels in November. Now, our domestic use was down as well by 375 million bushels, but we also had an increase in export of approximately 425 million bushels. So we're making less corn and we're selling it overseas partially. And so that leaves us with the ending stocks, which is the sum of the production and the exports. You know, corn availability in the United States is down right now. And that's why we've seen price go from $3 a bushel on August 1 to $4.80 a bushel today. And quite frankly, you know, there's some speculation that we probably haven't found the top of the corn market quite yet. And so it brings further importance to this discussion about keeping heifers developed properly and at hitting that target weight, but doing it in a way that's profitable so that we don't end up our heifer development being a money loser in the long run. Okay. Now, when we run into periods like this where gain becomes expensive, or grain becomes expensive, what it does is it changes the dynamics of what our development program should look like. High quality forage becomes more valuable during times like this due to high feed prices. And consequently, even though you may not see it in the related in the market, Low quality forage is less valuable to us because the low quality forage is going to be further away from meeting the nutrient requirements needed for the growth and the proper development of these heifers. And to basically to translate that into English for y'all, feed the good hay to the growing animals. The older, poorer quality hay, that should go to a mature cow who's not trying to grow. She's just merely trying to maintain her body reserves. Now, one thing that's probably going to be at least a little different ideas is to talk about the cost of gains associated with heifer development and trying to keep those costs of gain in line with some industry averages so that we don't develop these heifers unprofitably. And I don't think a lot of people think about what a cost of gain or a cost per day target should be in these heifer development systems. But I want to at least open up that conversation with us here today, because approximately 70% of heifer development costs are nutrition related, at least according to several different authors. Okay. So cost of gain, that's the dollar spent per pound of weight gain put on these animals. It should always be, regardless of the system that you're setting up, it should always be less than the value of that gain or the value of the additional weight that's put on an animal between purchase and sale. Something that backgrounders, stocker, feedlot people spend a lot of time thinking about: cost of gains, value of gains. We may not think about it as much during heifer development, but I want to bring to the discussion today. So bear with me here, and this is not a scenario where we're figuring the cost of gains on our own heifers. We're in this hypothetical scenario. We are taking heifers that we bought in November, 500-pound heifers that we paid $1.50 a pound for. Sorry, I had to check to make sure I had my example. And these heifers, let's just assume in this case that this heifer failed to become pregnant and we had to sell her as a feeder animal next in the following May, and we sold her for $1.30 a pound, weighing 800 pounds. Okay. So on a total cost basis, we spent $750 for that heifer to purchase her, and then we sold her for $1,000.40. Now that gross revenue of $290, the difference between the two for 300 pounds of gain, that means that every pound of gain to break even, we would need to have spent less than 96 cents per pound of gain on to get those animals to be profitable. Okay. Now that number is in line with what you would see currently in the feedlots. Current month placement cattle on feed, we're looking at about 91 cent cost of gain, so cost per pound of weight gain. That value of gain looks like it would be profitable right now, at least if you were doing a feedlot comparison. There's a couple of pieces that I don't think we need to consider when it comes to a heifer development system that we may not currently. All feedlots and starter yards, backgrounding yards, stocker operations are going to charge some kind of an overhead fee or a yardage. That's a charge for your time and your labor. That's typically going to be somewhere between 30 and 50 cents per animal per day. Now, your vet and medicine costs, depending on the investment that you put into your reproductive technologies, turning a bull out, et cetera, that could range anywhere from $30 on the low end in a natural service kind of, low input type system versus a, multiple rounds of artificial insemination could be over $80 a head. So, make sure to factor those costs in as well as you're thinking about what the cost of gain is and what the potential profit of developing heifers could be. Okay. Now, when we look at backgrounding operations, typically a backgrounding operation is going to be profitable when their cost of gains are approximately 2/3 the cost of cost of gains in a feedlot. Okay. Now we use 96 cents in the previous slide. So what I'm saying is that if you're developing heifers for less than 60 cents per pound of gain, you are developing a profitable female, even if she does not become pregnant, and two, you're in line with kind of what the industry average is right now for growth of animals between in a similar weight range. So just for your information, in case you don't know, a backgrounding operation is typically going to be a pre-feedlot environment where we take wean calves and we try to put a couple 100 pounds of weight on them. So, you know, somewhere between, get them from 5 to 700 to 750 pounds before they go onto the final feedlot that they're going to reside in and be finished for harvest. Okay. So the question is, how are we going to spend the $290, the difference between the sale and the purchase price of an open heifer, on development? Now, this is where I'm going to stop the first half. The next piece is going to get into the actual nuts and bolts of formulating a ration for these heifers. So I want to stop right here. How's our time for questions, Jordan? Are we okay? So I'm happy to take questions from the audience here. Happy to take questions from Zoom. I'll make sure to repeat them if they come from the audience for those of y'all that are on Zoom. In the back. Okay, so the question, I'm going to repeat it just for so our audience on Zoom can hear, was a comment on the estimated reproductive costs that I put on the slide. I had a range of $30 to $80. I actually pulled that out of a textbook, which it's probably got a little age on it now. And so the comment from the audience was that those numbers might have been a little on the low end based on Murphy's Law in terms of natural service, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I completely agree with the comment from the audience that if anything, those development costs are shaded low. They're not too high. If anything, they're too low. So we're in complete agreement there. I just wanted to put something that was known rather than just kind of pulling my number out of the air. So thank you for that comment. Okay, so to repeat the question that came in via chat, so I used the $1.30 as kind of the ceiling in terms of cost of gains. And the question was, can we afford a greater cost of gain than that if a vast majority of these females become pregnant? And I agree with that sentiment on the surface, but the question that we get into when we look at a situation like that is, you know, one, what's our pregnancy rate? Two, you know, if our pregnant females are profitable, do our unpregnant females, are they so unprofitable that they drag the entire system down? You know, and to be honest, Dr. Volkman, that's a lot of my bias coming into play here. I'm a 55% guy who would like to, you know, develop more heifers, a greater proportion of heifers on a lower plane of nutrition, and kind of figure out, you know, who's going to be productive in that type of a setting, rather than maybe a develop fewer heifers but manage them more intensively. That's as much of a personal preference as it is anything else. Probably because I come from the desert in New Mexico. All righty, thanks y'all. I'll come back and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of rations in the next half of this talk.
My presentation, I've got two, so they're all in the same PowerPoint. So we'll go through the first part, and then when I talk again, we'll finish it up. So the first part is talking about the health program within the Show Me Select heifer program. And so they had a meeting earlier, and there's going to make some adjustments here, and I'll mention those as we go through. But you can go to the website and bring up this kind of neat little chart that goes over all the health protocols that need to be done, and it's broken down between the different areas, which I'm going to go through. But we have some vaccines, parasite control, looking at the eyes and ears of the animals, looking at structural soundness at weaning, pre-breeding, at breeding, and then pregnancy exam, and then at pre-sale. And we're going to go through this. And I've got highlighted here, all products listed must be used according to label directions. So it's important to work with your veterinarian. I don't know if we have producers on here, but or the veterinarians to work with your producers to make sure that they're using these vaccines appropriately. So the first area is weaning. And because in the Show Me Select program, there are some of these cattle that are sold, some of these heifers are sold, are sent out of state. So it's a requirement to have calf foot vaccination against brucellosis. And so then they receive a OCV tag. Now, just a reminder, you know, if the heifers have an 840 RFID number, that can be used as well. So roughly that 4 months to 1 year of age is the requirement for that. Around weaning too, vaccination against IBR, BVD, PI3, BRSV, and lepto. And I've got highlighted here vibriosis. So that was one thing that we addressed at the Show Me Select program this morning, the board meeting. I had gotten calls from practitioners saying they were having a hard time getting vaccines, vibriosis vaccine or it in combination. And so our discussion, my recommendation to them, and they voted on it and to implement, is that vibriosis won't be a requirement anymore for the Show Me Select program. It's advised, but it's not a requirement. The other thing that was discussed this morning on here is the 7-way Clostridium vaccine. One of the things that has been noted is that maybe occasionally a bigger knot, and I'm assuming probably coming from the Clostridium. So as you work with your producers, it's probably advisable to discuss with them which type of Clostridium, using one that maybe has less reaction there, and so that they don't end up with a bigger knot that could potentially keep them out of a sale. And it's important, once again, reading the label to make sure you booster these vaccines appropriately. This is a great time to remove those horns and skewers so you don't have to worry about it later on. Parasite control as needed. So once again, working with your producers to strategically deworm is important. And then just a note that all heifers that end up in the sale must be BVD PI negative, okay? So this might be a great time to go ahead and take a sample to verify that they are negative for BVD persistently infected. Just a reminder, look at those eyes and ears of the cattle. So you can't have eye blemishes for heifers that go through the sale, and you can't have frozen ears. So it'd be a good time to evaluate that. As each of these times you're working these cattle, it's important to be doing that. Pre-breeding, once again, you're going to booster the IBR, BVD, lepto, and once again, the vibriosis is now, depending on if you can get it or not, it's not required, so it's optional. It's optional. And then a little note here on the modified live versus the killed products, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit in subsequent slides. And once again, parasite control as needed. At pregnancy exam, other than doing the pregnancy exam, the other thing is to booster the lepto, okay? So at the time you're doing this initial pregnancy exam, within 90 days of the start of the breeding season, be sure to be boosting these animals with lepto. Once again, another time where if parasite control is needed, you can do that. And it should be noted that for the program, that pregnancy exam must be performed by 90 days from the start of the breeding season. So if you do a timed AI program, 90 days from that timed AI, or from the time you turn in a bull if you're just using a bull for service. Pre-sale. So now those heifers that are going through the sale, so now the parasite control, this is required at this point pre-sale, and treated for internal and external within 30 days of the sale. Be sure that the label for the internal parasites is for immature stages as well. And at this point, they absolutely have to be negative for BVDPI, and then they have to be reconfirmed that they're still pregnant within 30 days. All right. So just a little bit of a reminder on how the immune system works. And when I give this to students, this is actually from Dr. Bob Larson, who used to be at the University of Missouri. He's at Kansas now. But it's a good visual picture. They're reminding us that we almost have two arms of the immune system. It's not that simplistic, but this helps. And the left arm is the humoral response. Those typically are antibodies or B lymphocytes. The right arm is the T lymphocytes, or the cell-mediated response. Both these are important. We do know that a lot of times with viruses that cell-mediated is as important or more important than the antibodies. So that's important to know as we decide which vaccines to pick to use in these programs. So just a little quick slide on modified live versus killed. Modified live, just comparing the two categories or two types of products. So modified live tends to have quicker immunity. And part of that is because a lot of times modified live, all you need is an initial vaccination that you get the response you want from one dose versus a killed. Almost all killed, not all, but almost all killed products need a booster to get that full effect, okay? If you don't booster those vaccines, you don't get the big response you want, all right? So quicker immunity modified live. Typically modified lives have longer immunity, longer time than the killed. Modified live does a good job with cell-mediated. Most killed products don't stimulate the cell-mediated as well, okay? There's less reactions as far as reactions, the calf or the animal reacting to the vaccine. There's less of that with modified live, more with killed, and a lot of times that's because the adjuvant that's added to killed to stimulate immune response. And it doesn't matter which ones you use, handle them according to label, handle them carefully. And I'm going to talk about that a little later too. Now talking about modified live versus killed in pregnancy, because over the last couple years, there's been real debate whether we need to be using modified live prior to breeding. George Perry out of South Dakota had some data that showed potentially that using a modified live prior to breeding, that there is a decrease in pregnancy rates, okay? And I just want to make this note between the beef and dairy industries, okay? In the beef industry, there's a lot of variable vaccination history on animals versus a lot of, especially the progressive type dairies, a lot of those heifers get 3 to 4 doses of modified live before breeding, whereas in beef, maybe or maybe not. And part of that is in the beef is because you minimize the handling of these animals versus within the dairy, we're handling them much more often. So once again, there's been papers indicating a decreased pregnancy per AI when using modified live in the beef industry. In the dairy industry, the papers show no decrease. Okay, and it might be back to that prior vaccination history. On the pictures here, the one on the left, the beef is actually one of our beef heifers, and our heifers tend to get a couple of doses of modified live prior to ever being bred, and we don't see that decrease as the papers had done. But we know the history, and we have a long history of modified lives. Once again, just a reminder, the PIs, if you're going to put animals in the sale, they have to be BVD, persistently infected, negative, okay? And that's the one thing about using modified lives, and we're going to address that. Once again, if I want to help prevent persistently infected animals, if I want to prevent that, other than making sure my animals aren't PIs to begin with, one of the ways I can do is by using these vaccines. And most of the vaccines that are labeled for prevention of PIs are modified lives. And I've listed the ones that are available out there in the industry. Here, there's one killed product that has the label. And when I say killed, it has a killed BVD in it and a killed IVR, and that's Cattlemaster. So most of them are modified live. The one killed product that has a label for PI prevention is Cattlemaster Gold FP. So what am I to do? What should I do? So if I have a known background, I probably can use modified live 30 to 60 days prior to breeding, and I'll probably be okay. If I have an unknown background, then I probably want to go towards a killed product and use something like Cattlemaster Gold. But the thing to note here, though, is if I do that killed product, if I haven't used that vaccine at weaning, I'm going to have to booster it now. So I've got to think ahead of time of when I can get this done prior to breeding. Okay, so once again, do you know the history? If you're not concerned about PIs, which I would say you should be, if you're not concerned about that, then 30 to 60 days, you can use modified live or killed, okay? All right, with that, I know I gotta move kind of quick here. Parasites, once again, parasite control, deworming is needed except for that pre-sale. But I would say this is something if you're thinking about if you're talking about spring breeding on your Show Me Select, when you're working them, let's be thinking about internal worms as well as fly control. Once again, you can't have any scarring on the eyes, so you want to control against pink eye, so fly control. In the fall, you want to think about internal worms as well as lice control. If you're concerned about your dewormer, you can always do a fecal egg count reduction test. So parasites, spring, internal worms, flies, fall, internal worms, and lice. So like I said, I was going to cover a little bit on handling vaccines. I use this once again, especially using modified lives, only mix what you use in the next hour. You know, the vaccine, keep it cool. Keep it modified lives, especially keep it out in the sunlight. That's one thing that really annoys me is when I see people using modified lives and it's not kept cool and it's in the sunlight and you go from a really good vaccine to a really poor vaccine, okay? Be aware of the expiration date. And then especially if you're using modified lives, be aware that you can't use disinfectants. So when I use modified lives to clean those syringes that I might be using, I use just hot water. Changing needles. Anytime you go back into the bottle, you should change the needle. Also, if you get any burrs on your needle, it should be changed. Keep track of records, and just be aware that cattle, you can't overdo the gram-negative vaccines. And so I just have up here the different organisms that we know are gram-negatives. So I especially when it gets warmer, I don't want to be giving more than 3 of these at a time. Dairy cattle, you wouldn't want more than 2 at a time in the hot weather. Okay. And then just a final slide to wrap up here for this first session. Different routes of administration. Of course, we have intranasal, oral, intramuscular, sub-Q, and intradermal, which is not very common. And on this bull, I've got where we should be giving these vaccines up there in the neck region, okay? And then for sub-Q, you could go behind there as well. And I think with that, that's the end of my health program.
All right, great. So yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm excited to get the chance to talk to you today. And this first talk will be basically about the basics of EPDs and how we use those to select sires. So in this case, it would be the service sires. So in the beef industry, we've long had this sense of tradition is very important to us. And tradition is very important to me. It's why I'm involved in the beef industry. This is my grandfather selling a bull in the Southwest Colorado Hereford Association sale, and he did quite well there. But one of the things that my grandfather really tried to instill in me was making sure we were doing things the right way. And so tradition in the beef industry is great until it holds us back from doing things in a better way when that's available. So one of the ways, next slide, that I've tried to get people to transition to is thinking about what is the legacy we're leaving for the next generation. And so this is a picture of my 2 boys, and hopefully we are operating as a beef industry in a way that there'll be a strong and vibrant beef industry for them to be a part of. Now, if we aren't open to adopting new practices, adopting new technologies, I don't think we'll have a strong and vibrant beef industry. But my hope is, my belief is, that we have enough profit motivated people in the industry that we will see that technology adoption, we will see improvement in the industry, and there will be this strong and vibrant beef industry. Next slide. So how do we get there? How do we get to making sure we have this legacy of a strong beef industry? For me, it is very simple. One word, sustainability. Making sure we're doing things in a way that's sustainable. So that means environmental stewardship. That means social responsibility, raising beef in a way that our customers are comfortable purchasing that beef. And then, of course, profitability. If our operations aren't profitable, there isn't going to be a beef industry. There isn't going to be an operation for that next generation. So one of the tools we've had as a beef industry that have been around for over 40 years is EPDs. But when we survey the beef industry, these are repeatedly underused in making decisions. EPDs absolutely work. If you're not using them, you're missing out on opportunities to be more profitable. So if you leave today from my talks with no other information, leave with that simple message that EPDs work. Okay, so now we're going to talk about selection decisions. These selection decisions apply whether we're thinking about selecting heifers or, more in the frame of today's talk, selecting service sires to either produce the next generation of heifers or to service the sires, to service the heifers that we're trying to get bred. So for hundreds of years, we used phenotypic selection. Phenotypic selection is either measuring something on the animal or looking at the animal and using that information to make the decision, does this animal become a parent of the next generation? So hypothetically, let's say we have these two bulls here, and they're both raised on the same farm with the same management, with the same opportunities to be productive, okay? If that's the case, then this bull on the right has done a much better job of turning forage and feed into growth, muscle, fleshing, etc. Okay, now let's assume, so go ahead and click, that these two bulls were actually raised in two different environments. So the one on the now still in that very lush environment, but the one on the left is raised in the desert Southwest. Now we don't know if the differences between these two bulls are due to their genetics or due to their environment. Okay, next. So whenever we use phenotypic selection, it doesn't account for environmental differences. Okay. How many of you go to a bull sale and take a shovel with you and bring home a shovel load of dirt? Who goes to a bull sale to bring home some dirt? Who goes to a bull sale and comes home with 2 bags of feed? The purpose of going to a bull sale is to purchase genetics. That's what we're trying to get at, right? And so hopefully, when we're trying to make a genetic decision, we're using genetic information. So whenever we use phenotypic selection, it's going to be less accurate, and it's simply going to limit the rate at which we can make genetic progress. So I always want to make sure that we talk about EPDs, EPDs, EPDs. We throw at that acronym constantly, but I think it's very easy to lose the meaning of what that acronym means. So EPD stands for expected progeny difference, okay? And expected is an extremely loaded word in this acronym. Here, when we use the word expected, we're not using it the way a normal person would. We're using it the way that a goofy statistician would use it, okay? When we talk about expected here, not only are we talking about a prediction of the future, but it also has a meaning of the average of the number we're talking about, okay? So when we talk about EPDs, we're not talking about a single data point. We're talking about the average of hundreds or thousands of individuals. So what is that average that we're predicting with an EPD? That average is the progeny, is the calves out of that animal, okay? A bull's EPD may not be that predictive of his own performance. What it's predicting is how his calves are going to perform, okay? So sometimes we run into a situation where the EPD doesn't really match what we're seeing with our eyes, but that can be because of the genetics that that animal is carrying. Now, finally, the D stands for difference. If I give you the EPDs of a single bull, and that's the only information I give you, that information is absolutely worthless. We cannot use a single set of EPDs to make a decision. EPDs always need a comparison between two different points. We're either comparing a bull to the breed average, or we're comparing two different bulls. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind when we talk about EPDs. So in my earlier days as an extension professional, I did a lot of work online and online communities. And one of the things that I really loved about online is talking to you all today. If you disagree with me, you'll just think in your mind, he's full of it, and you'll walk out the back door politely. When somebody disagrees with you online, they don't hold any punches. Okay, so I've heard all of the opinions about EPDs. And one of the things that beef producers often don't understand about genetic predictions is there's a key piece of information that we have to calculate an EPD. We have to have some sort of measure of genetic similarity. We have to have some measure of relatedness. What that measure of relatedness allows us to do is take that overall bell curve and to split it into two. And it identifies a bell curve for genetic variation and a bell curve for other sources of variation. When we get that bell curve for genetic variation, now we have genetic information to make our genetic decisions. Okay, so this measure of genetic similarity is essential to separate those sources of variation and give you all, as beef producers, a tool to make genetic decisions. So here's how EPDs are designed to work in practice. We have two bulls here, the black bull and the gold bull. The black bull has a weaning weight EPD of 2 pounds. The gold bull has a weaning weight EPD of 22 pounds, okay? The gold bull obviously doesn't weigh 22 pounds at weaning, okay? It's not necessarily telling us much about his weaning weight. What we do is on the same farm with the same management to the same cow base, we breed these two bulls and produce 100 calves out of both bulls. Now, the average of the black bull's calves at weaning weigh 495 pounds. The average of the gold bull's calves weigh 515 pounds. There's a 20-pound difference in the EPDs of those two bulls. 22 minus 2 is 20, right? That 20-pound difference in the EPD is predicting the 20-pound difference that we see in the average of their calf crop, okay? Now, we'll move down to this last figure here, is we've got two bell curves, the black bull's bell curve and the gold bull's bell curve. The EPD is predicting the middle of those bell curves and the difference between the middle of those two bell curves. But in biology and genetics in particular, we're always dealing with randomness, okay? We're always dealing with variation. So there's going to be some of those gold bull calves that underperform the black bull average, and there's going to be some of those black bulls calves that outperform the gold bull average, okay? But what we do with EPDs is we move this bell curve whichever direction we want it to go. EPDs are simply a tool. It's up to you as a cattle producer to make the decision of which direction you want that bell curve to move. And so we talked about, so this is kind of the three pieces of information that go into a traditional EPD. We talked about how important that pedigree information is because it gives us that measure of genetic similarity. We also have the animal's own performance and we have the animal's progeny performance. That performance data is always going to be looked at through the lens of a contemporary group. That contemporary group is going to be a group of calves that are from the same farm, the same calving season, and were managed the same, okay? And so what that contemporary group effect does is takes into account environmental and management differences. So what we're left with in the EPD is actual genetic differences. We're taking into account those management and environment differences to get a more accurate genetic number. So in the beef industry, we report EPD accuracy with what we call a Beef Improvement Federation accuracy. Okay, and so the numbers you look at when you look at a sire catalog or a bull sale are going to be BIF accuracy. So that's that red curve here. And so if we have a bull who has a BIF accuracy of 0.4, okay, his actual accuracy in terms of how a geneticist would think about it would be 0.8, okay? These tools are very accurate. They do a very good job of predicting the animal's true genetic merit, okay? So really don't undervalue how well these tools actually work. Okay, let's talk for a minute. We're trying to identify a heifer bull, either an AI sire or a natural service cleanup bull. Do we look at the actual birth weight? Do we look at the birth weight EPD? Do we look at calving ease direct? Do we look at calving ease maternal? Or maybe we do what a lot of beef producers do, and we're going to look at three of those. We're going to say, I'm going to look at the actual birth weight, the birth weight EPD, and the calving ease direct, and I'm going to look at all three of those together. What our human intuition tells us is if I look at all three of those together, I'm going to make my decision more accurate. But what you've actually done is if you look at actual birth weight EPD, and calving ease direct together, you've simply added up the uncertainty in those three. And instead of having this much uncertainty in your decision, you now have this much uncertainty in your decision. So the best way to do this is to focus on the economically relevant trait, okay? How many of you turned in, when you went to sell a calf crop, took along their birth weights and got paid at market for their birth weight? Is anybody actually getting paid at market? If you're not a seed stock producer, let's talk about commercial production. In commercial production, is anybody getting paid for birth weight? Is there a cost associated with birth weight? The economically important trait is calving ease. Was that calf born unassisted, or did we have to spend labor cost to help the heifer deliver it? Or did we have to pay for a veterinarian to come and help deliver it or do a C-section, etc.? So birth weight and birth weight EPDs are only valuable because they help us predict calving ease direct. Calving ease direct is the number to be looking at when we're looking for heifer bulls. In terms of calving ease maternal, that's for identifying cows that are going to have an easier job delivering a calf, okay? But when we're thinking about bull selection in terms of a heifer service sire, we're going to look at calving ease direct. Really briefly, want to touch on some other underappreciated traits in the beef industry. Stayability, sustained cow fertility based on the breed association, you're looking at their numbers. That is a huge driver of profitability. If that's not one of the numbers you're looking at, when you're looking at bulls, when you're looking at females, you need to add that to your criteria, okay? Heifer pregnancy, obviously, we know reproduction is a huge economic driver, something that's important to look at. Eric already mentioned this today, mature cow weight. If you're not trying to moderate the mature cow size in your herd, you're probably leading to some inefficiencies in your herd in terms of leading to cows that are perhaps too big for what your management or what your environment will allow. And milk, feel free to come and talk to me afterwards about milk, but when we get animals with high milk potential, their internal organs grow larger and they become a much less efficient factory, okay? And that inefficiency lasts 365 days of the year, okay? So not only can they not reach their milk potential, but they are more inefficient the entire year. So milk is something that also probably needs to be moderated. I think here on fescue, where the fescue is already moderating some of that milk production, we don't want bottom of the breed for milk potential, but we probably also don't want top of the breed for milk potential. Okay, so then transitioning a little bit, in the beef industry, what's the most important trait that we need to be selecting for? Go ahead and shout out some answers. What's the most important trait that we should be putting the most emphasis on as cattle producers? Weaning weight, okay, great. Other ideas? Against milk, okay. Reproduction, okay. So weaning weight is important, decreased milk is important, reproduction is important. Why? Go ahead. Okay, feed intake, and what was the other one? Carcass traits. So none of those are my answers, but all of those touch on my answers. So next slide. The most important trait in beef production is profit. Does this bull, does this cow help you be more profitable? The reason all of the traits you all mentioned, carcass, weaning, reproduction, milk, et cetera, the reason they're important is because they influence profitability, okay? Now, is there an EPD? Is there a genetic prediction for profit? Yes, there is. So let's go to the next slide. The tool that predicts profitability is an economic selection index, okay? So we don't call it an EPD, but it's a genetic prediction, just like an EPD is. Next slide. So what is an economic selection index? It's a combination of EPDs in which each EPD is weighted according to its economic importance. Just like weaning weight EPD is expressed in pounds, because it's predicting differences in pounds, economic selection indexes are expressed as dollar values because they're predicting profit differences. And good indexes take into account both the revenue and the cost side of the profit equation. Different breeds are going to have different indexes, and even more importantly, there's going to be different indexes based on your production system. Okay, are you keeping replacement females? Are you using terminal sires? How are you marketing your calves, etc.? So it's important that you think about your own production system and identify the index that matches your system. I think in a lot of cases, when we look at either a sire catalog or a bull sale, we're running into information overload. An index allows you to focus in on a single number to identify the most profitable bull. Okay, next slide. So there was a group that included Zoetis, Top Dollar Angus, Gardner Angus, and a feedlot that actually did a field test of dollar beef. And so what they did is in the same year on the same farm, they produced 25 low dollar B calves, which had an average of $47. And they produced 18 high dollar B calves, which had an average of $141. They DNA tested these animals, and the DNA test results matched up with the economic index predictions. Next slide. And so the dollar beef index would have predicted $187 difference between these two groups in terms of their profitability. When they actually did the accounting in terms of the actual profitability of these animals, what they saw, next slide, was a $215 profit difference. And so for sure, dollar B didn't underpredict the profit differences, and it was actually pretty spot on to what the actual profit differences were between these two groups of animals, okay? So these economic selection indexes work, and they help you identify more profitable animals. So in this case, if we're thinking about identifying bulls, that economic selection index is going to lead your decision-making to the right animals. Take-home messages. EPDs work. Identify ways to use them in your operation. Use calving ease direct. Focus on the economically important traits to select heifer bulls. If we're talking about mature cows, probably don't need to worry about calving ease direct. And then finally, those economic selection indexes are going to simplify your decisions and help focus your decisions on profitability.
So I'm going to talk about a couple of things in sort of a combined session. And the first is using pre-breeding exams to assess the development status of beef heifers. So first of all, a pre-breeding exam is required of heifers in the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer program, but I'd encourage you to think of it as an opportunity, whether you're a producer or a veterinarian offering these services to a head producer. Generally, this is going to be performed 30 to 60 days before breeding. That's essentially what our requirements are through the Show Me Select organization. And the nice thing about that is that can coincide with the start of a long-term progestin-based synchronization protocol. For example, the protocol that's most commonly used in this program is the 14-day CEDAR PG program, which is a CEDAR, a progesterone-releasing intravaginal insert, in place for a period of 14 days and then removed. And then 16 days after that CEDAR is removed, administration of prostaglandin, followed by, in most cases, a fixed time artificial insemination at 66 hours after prostaglandin and CEDAR removal, although we'll talk about some other strategies to accomplish an AI program as well. So that being a 33-day long protocol makes it a pretty nice opportunity to for example, perform a pre-breeding exam, do some pre-breeding booster vaccinations, et cetera, at the time that CEDAR is actually placed. So the first component of a pre-breeding exam that I'm going to talk about is pelvic screening as a tool to really minimize the incidence of dystocia. So most of the time that is going to be performed with a rice pelvimeter. There are some other pelvimeters out there as well. This is far and away the most commonly used tool. And Emily, this one, if you click on the image, it'll play a little video. There you go. So this is Scott Poock. Scott, if you're watching, that's your hand. And you can see how that is actually performed. So that the height of that pelvic opening is taken, if you play it one more time, from the pubic symphysis up to the sacral vertebrae. And you can see that the veterinarian's hand is placed in the rectum of the animal at the time that pelvimeter is also in place in order to really position it on this point of the pubic symphysis and make sure that is correctly aligned and not slanted forward or slanted backward, which would exaggerate the reading. And then the width of the pelvis is taken, as you can see right there, at the widest point of what we call the ileal shafts, just perpendicular to the height of the pelvic measurement. And so obviously that winds up with a height and a width. We're going to multiply those together and get area. That obviously gives you the area of a square, not actually of what the pelvis is, but this is the convention for doing it, is height times width. So for example, let's say I took a vertical measurement of 13.5 centimeters and a width measurement of 11.5 centimeters. That would be 155.25 square centimeters in terms of the pelvic area. So pelvic area is really useful information. I'm going to give you just a little bit of history on how some of this work came to be. There were three very well-respected scientists at the Miles City Research Station in Montana, working with USDA, and they did some excellent work on pregnancy and parturition and puberty attainment, and they are still called the three Bobs to this day. Well, one of those guys, Bob Bellows, really did a lot of great work on parturition and in particular dystocia. And some of the work was really fascinating in terms of trying to relate several measurements to potential incidents of dystocia. And you might think, well, what about the width from, pin to pin, or what about, the slant of the pelvis? And you'll see all these things anecdotally referred to as people advise you about selection of replacement heifers. Well, the one that really has value is not an external measurement of the animal, but an internal measurement of the actual pelvic opening of that female. But the important thing to realize is that really only has value in conjunction with what the birth weight of that calf is actually going to be. So doing a pelvic screening in this program does not give you license to go use an exceptionally high birth weight or not Cattlemen's bull. And likewise, using those technologies together, doing a screening for pelvic area, and then also placing selection pressure on Cattlemen's when we make sire selection decisions, really helps bring two different solutions together to drive down incidence of dystocia. So that's really what we're trying to do here. So on to the next slide. As we look historically at how this information was used, and really the mathematically correct way to do this, I'll grant you, is to take the pelvic area, and then based on the age of that heifer in months, come up with use the appropriate, what was called the division factor, and come up with a maximum safe, quote unquote, birth weight that could be deliverable by that heifer. Now, is anybody actually going to sit down and do that? I think as an industry, we've decided not really, and that we're probably better off establishing, especially in a commercial heifer development program like this one, safe cutoffs. And so that's the approach that we've taken in this program. We've established what we consider to be a safe cutoff for screening out heifers that have an unacceptably small or also in some cases an abnormally shaped pelvis. And likewise, we've taken that approach with Cattlemen's direct, right? We've determined that depending on the breed of the sire, at some level, we feel that Cattlemen's direct is not high enough to justify the risk associated with that sire. And likewise, we have an accuracy requirement for Cattlemen's as well, so that we're confident about where that EPD actually is. So pelvic measurement in this program and in most commercial programs really ought to be thought of as a screening tool rather than a selection tool. And what I mean by that is if I was going to make a selection tool, right, I would rank all the animals. And if I was going to select for something, I would probably try to pick the animals that were on the one extreme of the other to try to pull selection for that trait in a positive direction, right? That's not how we ought to use pelvic area, because if we do a pelvic measurement, for example, and we throw it all on an Excel spreadsheet and we rank all those heifers from biggest to smallest in terms of pelvic area, and we think I'm going to pick the heifers that have the biggest pelvises and I'm never going to have to worry about calving difficulty again, what we actually did is select massively for frame. And that's what will happen over time, is you will select for frame, because this is a physical measurement, right? So the more conservative way, and the more, I would argue, the more commercially appropriate way to use pelvic area is to use it as a screening tool and have this minimum below which we're going to deem heifers unacceptable. So now the question is, well, what should that be? And to be honest with you, those recommendations have varied a little bit in the literature. Probably the most long-standing one is 140 square centimeters. The Show Me Select program uses 150 square centimeters. But that's with a caveat. So it has to be 150 square centimeters at the time of pre-breeding, or if that heifer's pelvic area is less than 150 square centimeters. Let's say, for example, it was that 12 by 10 on the previous slide, and that was 120 square centimeters. Then as a veterinarian or as a producer, you're going to look to your veterinarian and try to get a little bit of guidance. For example, if that heifer has not attained puberty, is that all that informative? If that heifer has attained puberty and is a fairly well-developed heifer, in most cases, the wise advice is probably to cull that animal out of the system, right? That low outlier for pelvic area is probably likely to present some challenges in terms of dystocia. But if that heifer has not attained puberty, in most cases, it's fairly reasonable to simply remeasure that heifer at a later date, for example, at pregnancy diagnosis, and try to ask at that time whether she has attained a level that is safe, because of the rate of change in that pelvic area around the time of attainment of puberty a lot can happen there. So in the Show Me Select program, that expectation is that if a heifer does have to be remeasured, and we will allow a heifer to be remeasured, she has to be 180 square centimeters at the time of the initial pregnancy diagnosis. And that has to be performed within 90 days of AI. So we occasionally will get some criticism about, you're pushing some smaller frame genetics or something out of the program. I really don't feel that way. I think this is just a safe commercial cutoff. And by having this opportunity to remeasure some heifers, I think it's fairly appropriate. So that's the rationale for that. It doesn't control for everything. And so as a producer or as a veterinarian working with a producer, help them understand that if you might go back, Emily, to that previous one, just help them understand that you could still have some abnormal presentations of calves. And this doesn't have anything to do with that. And then also it doesn't give you this license to all of a sudden pick sires that don't have cavities at the appropriate level that we would call safe for heifers. Okay, so in addition to evaluating pelvic area as an opportunity to screen out some heifers that are just unacceptable, or what I would say is just higher risk, I'm also have the opportunity to evaluate puberty attainment. And if you think about that, historically, how have we done that as an industry in heifer development? We've really used indirect indicators. We've used things like weight, right? Or even size, or even visual appearance of heifers. And we've gone out and we've kind of eyeballed a pen of heifers, and we've said either, I feel fairly comfortable because this is what they've looked like in the past, and I've done reasonably well in the past. Or maybe next step after that is maybe we actually have some weights. Maybe we calculate, have they hit a certain target weight? And those are all useful, but they're indirect indicators of puberty attainment, right? Weight is associated with puberty attainment. Of course, size is associated with puberty attainment, but it's an indirect indicator, which means that for a heifer that is developed to 800 pounds, there's this curve around that in terms of whether that heifer is actually cyclic or not. So a reproductive tract evaluation, or a reproductive tract score, is an opportunity to directly evaluate pubertal attainment among an individual heifer. So not even just to look at a pen and feel good about a pen or concerned about a pen, but an individual heifer, a palpation on the reproductive tract transrectally. And in some cases, a veterinarian may choose to do this with the assistance of ultrasound. And in the vast majority of cases, it's done simply with palpation. And this scoring system is from 1 to 5. And so a 1 is a prepubertal or an infantile tract. And to give you an idea about what the size of that tract would be like, certainly would be less or similar to say the diameter of this pencil or pen, right? Often will have a very soft feel to it, can sometimes be very difficult to palpate. And then in terms of ovarian size, it may be actually difficult to find ovaries. They may be, pea-sized, lima bean size, somewhere in that range, and just have no meaningful follicular development. Now, a Tract Score 1 heifer really ought to be cold, except for in some pretty unusual commercial situations. And most of those Tract Score 1 heifers are in fact cold out of the program. We see that in our data, and I'll show you why here in a moment. A Tract Score 2 heifer and a Tract Score 3 heifer are what we would call peripubertal, or around the attainment of puberty. But the question is just how far is it going to be until they actually attain puberty? And admittedly, there's a little bit of subjectivity in what we give here as a days cutoff. We would estimate that a Tract Score 2 heifer is greater than 30 days away from attainment of puberty, whereas a Tract Score 3 heifer is within 30 days of attainment of puberty. So in a Tract Score 3 heifer, you will see somewhat more uterine development compared to a Tract Score 2 heifer. It may even have what we would call some tone to that uterus. And most importantly, we will palpate some mid-range follicles in that 8 to 10 millimeter range on the actual ovary or ovaries. Now, Tract Score 4 and a 5 are both cyclic, and there's no reason to discriminate between a Tract Score 4 or 5 or think that a 5 is better than a 4 or vice versa. It just happens to be the stage of the estrus cycle at which that Tract Score is performed. So in a Tract Score 4 heifer, she'll present totally differently because her uterus will be toned and coiled under the influence of estrogen, and she will have a large pre-ovulatory size follicle on one or potentially both ovaries. A Tract Score 5 heifer will have a completely different feel to the tract, actually, because it will be distended out and it will not have this rigid, toned, coiled feel to it. But the distinguishing feature in the Tract Score 5 is that there's a palpable corpus luteum on the ovary. So obviously this involves a little bit of palpation skill, and it involves some understanding of ovarian physiology, of uterine physiology, and it requires a little bit of familiarity with that. So that's not always something that a veterinarian has had the opportunity to develop skills in during veterinary school, or even during years of practice, depending on what kind of practice they've had and what services they've offered. So my advice to you as veterinarians is if this is something you want to do, invest the time to get good at that, and reach out to somebody like Scott Poock at the vet school and try to get some opportunities to actually build up a skill set there. I think it's really not challenging to do, especially if you have done a little bit of ovarian palpation, for example, in an embryo transfer context or something like that, you'll pick it up quite easily. But again, it does involve a little bit of skill and experience. Okay, so what is the actual science, the published literature say about reproductive tract scores? Why do we actually care? Well, it's an exceptionally good indicator for several things. One is it's an effective predictor for pregnancy rates to fixed time artificial insemination. And that's obviously a very economically relevant trait to our commercial and our seed stock producers. It's also fairly important information in terms of pregnancy rates by day of the breeding season. And as you've probably heard several times here today, not only from myself, but from Eric and from Jared, we really feel like attainment of pregnancy early in the breeding season is extremely important in heifers. And I would argue it's not only important in how we manage heifers, but how we select commercial heifers after the breeding season, just simply as profitable investments. And so that is really important, not only for our seed stock producers, where we're really concerned about fertility, but also for commercial producers, where we're concerned about the lifetime margin potential of those heifers. It's also very effective for predicting weaning weight of calves. And if that feels a little counterintuitive, just think that it has to do with when those heifers conceive in their first breeding season, right? If she conceives earlier, she calves earlier. If she calves earlier, that calf is older at weaning. If that calf is older at weaning, it's heavier at weaning, right? A calf from birth to weaning is often in that 1.7 to 2.2 pounds per day rate of gain. Certainly some of our modern cattle genetics can do that 2 to 2.2 range quite well. And so there's a lot of potential weaning weight from just, one estrus cycle worth of age, 21 days. So a reproductive tract score, if we look at how that actually bears itself out in our Show Me Select database, again, all heifers are required to have a pre-breeding exam. That has to include a pelvic screening, a pelvic measurement, and then also a reproductive tract score. And that information gets reported back, and we can then correlate that to pregnancy rates to fixed time AI. So this is a pretty large data set over the last 10 years, and 44,000 heifers, 44,500, excuse me. So what happens? First of all, let's look at the Tract Score 1 heifers. 10 out of 45 over that 10-year period actually became pregnant to fixed time artificial insemination. Now that's quite poor. I want you all to also notice that there's a very low N in that column, a very low number of heifers. And that's because most producers are culling those heifers at pre-breeding and not essentially wasting the, not only the semen and the synchronization product, but the continued cost of ownership in those heifers, of carrying those heifers for an extended period of time. If you think about, say, a pre-breeding exam performed 30 days before breeding, and then maybe a preg check performed around day 90, that's 120 days on feed that I would be carrying a Tract Score 1 heifer. There's a pretty good economic incentive not only to do the Tract Score, but to make action or to take actionable efforts to get those low productivity heifers off of the farm or ranch. Tract Score 2 heifers also fairly poor, and we do see a lot of producers choose to cull Tract Score 2 heifers as well. And I just would leave that to the discretion of the producer, just in terms of what they're trying to do. Another approach that I've seen used effectively is to try to, for example, in a commercial heifer development context where some of these heifers will be marketed, identify a group of heifers that needs a little more groceries, or that can be managed separately, or potentially even bred to calve later, to fill maybe a different marketing opportunity for heifers that are bred to calve later. So Tract Score 2 and 3 heifers is certainly appropriate to do that with. Tract Score 3 heifers in most cases, you really ought not be concerned about, particularly if they're going on a progestin-based estrus synchronization protocol. You see them doing fairly comparable with the 4s and 5s, and really no surprise there, since according to the scoring system, we would classify them as within 30 days of attainment of puberty. And most of these heifers are going on long-term, 33-day long protocols anyway. And again, tract score 4s and 5s, they're both cycling. We wouldn't expect a difference there, and there's no difference in that data set. So in terms then of how we use information not only on individual heifers, but to inform the development practices of the farm or ranch, I often want to know, well, what does this group look like as a whole? And I think this becomes then a really good opportunity for the veterinarian doing this and the producer getting this information to have a conversation about the development practices. Because if less than half of the heifers are cycling, in most cases, you probably have some kind of problem to address. And in some cases that may be nutrition, and maybe there's something that we can actually do right now, today, in these last 30, 33 days, and ramp those girls up so that we can catch them up. A big one though that I think that people need to pay more attention to, and are beginning to pay a lot of attention to, is age variation among heifers really kills you from a commercial heifer development standpoint. And it's really the earliest born heifer calves that are really, based on a lot of good data out of the University of Nebraska, that are really exceptional candidates in terms of their ability to become pregnant early. And a good recommendation is usually to only develop heifers, for example, that are born in the first half of the calving season, if it's a longer calving season. So often it's an opportunity to initiate those kinds of conversations and maybe think through some different selection practices for which heifer calves we actually develop as potential replacements. In some cases, you might find a parasite issue. In other cases, sire group differences. Another one that we've run into on some occasions is different sources of heifers, and not knowing whether those heifers had been implanted, and if they were, was it an implant that even has a label approval for use in replacement heifers? We typically tend to discourage all implant use in heifers, quite frankly. But so it can be an opportunity to troubleshoot some of those things. Okay, so a few final thoughts on reproductive tract evaluation, and then we'll go on to some breeding strategies. Aside from being required, it's just an opportunity. From my perspective, I always think more commercial than seed stock. It's just my own bias, but from my perspective, it's an opportunity to increase my margin in the heifer development business. And it's a cost reduction strategy, which sounds like an odd thing to say if I'm going to spend money to have a reproductive tract score performed. I realize that, or to a pelvic measurement performed. But again, I go back to how many days on feed can I avoid on these heifers? How quickly can I cash out of low profit potential heifers as replacement candidates? And as Eric mentioned, depending on how I've developed those heifers, maybe actually have a little bit of margin in them as just open feeder calves. So I think about that a lot from a commercial standpoint. It's a cost reduction strategy. The other opportunity that really is true is it may also increase revenue to do this, from the standpoint that you can make some management decisions. You might be able to alter nutritional status, generate more bred heifers per female developed, and ultimately have more heifers to choose from, impose some stricter selection criteria on heifers that are attained, for example, or just market more AI bred heifers or early conceiving heifers. There can be a lot of value there. And of course, it's just an opportunity to then identify some underlying problems in the overall system. And lastly, aside from screening out some heifers that are problematic from a puberty attainment or pelvic area perspective, you will catch some weird things, right? You will catch the free Martin heifers. You'll catch the heifer that there's no way she could be pregnant, right? You will catch those things in a reproductive tract evaluation. And there's a lot of value in that. In some cases, a lot of value if you find out that there are some really serious problems that you can address. Cystic heifers are not uncommon to find. There are all sorts of thoughts about that, but it's an opportunity to potentially intervene and treat those. And then again, large-scale heifer developers, certainly worked with some that have identified some problematic sources of heifers, and then been able to make some wiser decisions in the future about whom they source heifers from. Okay, before I jump right in, this is kind of a two-part talk in one. So before I jump right into breeding strategies, any burning questions on, you know, pre-breeding evaluation? Yes. Oh, okay. So what's that cutoff in terms of less than 30 days or? Sure. So you don't have to go find the slide again, Emily. So the question was about tract score 2 and 3 heifers. What exactly is it about the palpation that indicates to me is that she's greater than 30 days or less than 30 days? And I'll grant you there's a little bit of arbitrariness in that, right? Because I don't know 31 days from 29 days. But at the same time, if you think about the physiology of puberty attainment, it's really a brake coming off to allow a gas pedal to kick in, right? Because estradiol has a negative feedback relationship on LH pulsatility before puberty attainment. And then that switches and all of a sudden it becomes a gas pedal. So what happens as females approach puberty attainment is the level of follicular development on the ovary. Those waves are allowed to the dominant follicle of that wave is allowed to attain a somewhat larger follicle size as that break is coming off. And so that's a palpable feature. And then corresponding to that, we begin to see greater levels of development of the uterus because of the fact that estradiol is allowed to creep up a little bit as that break gets taken off. And so it's really that relationship of even though it sounds like it's subjective, you know, physical size of follicles, it does have some physiological, you know, meaningfulness. So that's what we're feeling there. It's follicle size on the ovaries and uterine horn development. Yeah. Diameter of the uterus, yes, and then also the physical presentation, the palpation of the uterus, and how much, you know, turgidity it has, you know, that feel to it. Interestingly, Emily Smith is probably grinning over here because she has a master's thesis project that's really interested in this particular question of how meaningful is each little component of those relative to one another. So it's a good question. It is. Absolutely. And stage of cycle at the time that you palpate them could influence that. And yeah, you're talking Emily's language now. Any other questions in terms of pre-breeding evaluation? Okay, I'm going to go on into breeding strategies. We can certainly circle back to pre-breeding evaluation as well. So in terms of breeding strategies or requirements in the Show Me Select program, first of all, producers are not required to use AI or natural service. And I always joke that, but you should probably do at least one. And so producers are not required to AI. A lot of our producers choose to. I think last year it was 96%, something in that range, chose to give at least one opportunity to conceive to AI. Or 96% of heifers received one opportunity to conceive to AI. There are some producers out there that are doing total AI programs with no natural service cleanup. So that's also completely on the table as a breeding strategy. So producers using AI have to report the breeding date or dates, the registration number of the AI bull used, and of course that bull has to meet certain requirements. The method of estrus synchronization, if estrus synchronization was used. We also encourage you to report some things like, you know, what was the actual AI approach that was used, and did that heifer express estrus prior to, for example, a timed AI? We love to get that kind of information, helps us build those data sets a little bit larger. And then producers using natural service bulls have to then report the exposure start and end dates, and then the registration number of that natural service bull. This has been mentioned already by Dr. Poock, but we require that a pregnancy diagnosis occur within 90 days of the start of the breeding season. And together with that, we have to request that producers do not expose bulls essentially within a 14-day period of the initial AI service. So we need that 2-week window to have the confidence about whether a heifer is truly carrying an AI pregnancy versus carrying a natural service pregnancy. But you might think, I'm going to give up fertility by not having bulls out there for 14 days. Not really, actually, because if the protocols are working the way that they ought to, there really shouldn't be heat activity occurring during that 14-day period of time. Okay, I'm going to refer you to several extension publications. Most of them are fairly new, actually, but that give some breeding recommendations for heifers in a little bit more detail than you've maybe seen from the university before. And we continue to have new breeding strategies, recommended from other parts of the country, and want to be very mindful that we, recommend to our producers in the state of Missouri time-tested approaches that we feel very good about. So first of all, if you or producers that you're working with are not familiar with estrus synchronization products in general, we have a pretty complete guide to estrus synchronization products as an MU extension publication that also has some videos embedded into it that actually just walk you through start to finish. How do you put in a seeder? How do you handle it? How do you do that appropriately? How do you give it an intramuscular injection of prostaglandin or GnRH, et cetera, et cetera. So that includes GnRH, prostaglandin, seeder, MGA. Refer you to that publication. In terms of those videos, they're also available independently on our YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook page. It's called Mizzou Repro on both ones. And then we have a few new publications that present some recommendations for synchronization approaches in heifers and cows, with natural service, with artificial insemination, and also with sex-sorted semen. And so this is the one for heifers. It's organized a little bit differently than some other national groups choose to present theirs, but I think you'll like it in terms of how it's presented. It's fairly clean, and I think it gives some good guidance especially for brand new producers. Again, natural service bulls are completely a valid way to service heifers in this program. Don't discourage that at all. I do like the idea of using some synchronization with natural service. And so if you have producers that are interested in that, or if you're interested in that, see that last publication on natural service. And lastly, we continue to get a lot of questions about use of sex-sorted semen in cows as well, but in particular in heifers. I think people see the opportunity to have heifers have heifer calves and further minimize the risk of dystocia, maybe accelerate some rates of genetic progress, et cetera. So if you're interested in sex-sorted semen and using that in conjunction with timed AI or with heat detection, I'd really refer you to that as a source of information. So we'll go one by one through some of the big breeding strategies for heifers, and I'll leave you with some recommendations. This is a protocol called the one-shot prostaglandin protocol. You can, for example, just heat detect an AI and simply administer one product. So run all those heifers through the chute at one time, or at least a large proportion of the heifers through the chute at one time, give a shot of prostaglandin. That's a very low-cost protocol from a pharmaceutical standpoint. And if the producer is comfortable with AI, or has a technician, readily available to do AI, this can work fairly well, except it's only going to work on heifers that are cycling. So that prostaglandin is only effective in heifers that have a corpus luteum, so that are cycling and can respond to that prostaglandin. Also notice that you have to heat detect for 5 days before prostaglandin, kind of for the same reason, is that if you don't do that, there's going to be some heifers that just don't respond to prostaglandin simply because of where they're at in their estrus cycle. So it's a fairly long period of estrus detection. 12 days would be the recommendation, 5 days before prostaglandin and for a week after. And so this is not a very commonly recommended protocol, and I generally would not recommend that one, especially if there's any concern at all about cyclicity in the heifers. Now, breeding strategies that involve some progestins are what we'll talk about next. And I would encourage you to use progestins, especially in commercial heifers, where we just, there's a lot of economic value in getting heifers to conceive as early as possible. But I actually wouldn't recommend that you use this protocol or the protocol on the next slide, the 5-day protocol, if you can instead use a longer-term protocol like the 14-day CEDAR PG protocol or the MGA prostaglandin protocol. And the reason is, these shorter protocols, although they're effective and they're a reasonable option if you're running out of time and there wasn't a lot of advanced planning, they're not nearly as effective in generating good first service AI pregnancy rates in heifers that weren't previously cycling at the start of the treatment. That progesterone in the CEDAR is effective for getting them induced to cycle, even if it's just 5 to 7 days, but their fertility on that first estrus is a little bit poorer. The MGA prostaglandin protocol, and I've shown that with a few different strategies for how to actually go about carrying out the artificial insemination approach. For example, you could heat detect and an AI for about 3.5 days after prostaglandin. You could apply an estrus detection aid, give prostaglandin, and do what we call a split time AI. We have some extension resources about that. Or do a fixed time AI at 72 hours. All reasonable approaches, just depending on the feasibility of the AI program. I don't discourage use of MGA at all. I think it's a very effective tool if you're an experienced cattle feeder. If you do your homework about how to do that well. If a heifer is already receiving a daily ration, for example, if we have heifers in a dry lot facility, this can be a wonderful protocol because we don't have to handle the heifers twice to put in a seeder and pull a seeder. So it becomes a one trip through the chute prior to AI protocol, if you really think about it. So that's a big plus. But the challenge is that we have to get that daily dose of MGA into those heifers. And that really requires some good feeding management. We do have some guidance about that in that guide to estrus synchronization protocol for folks that are interested in that. Lastly, though, if you are going to use a fixed time AI approach, slight boost based on some publications anyway, in terms of the 14-day seeder versus the MGA prostaglandin protocol, simply because of how synchronously those heifers come and heat prior to AI. And I mentioned this, attention to detail is really critical. So type and volume of the feed carrier, acclimation of heifers to that feed, the dose, the feeding schedule, the bunk space, just observing the behavior and making sure those animals are behaviorally coming up to eat at the bunk all at the same time. That's all very important with MGA. By far and away, this is the popular approach to breed heifers in the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer program, frankly, across the state of Missouri, and frankly, at this point, across the country, would be the 14-day seeder protocol, either with heat detection and timed AI, a split time AI, or a fixed time AI at 66 hours. So this is a seeder for 14 days, wait 16 days, give prostaglandin, and then the breeding approach. By far our preferred option that we would suggest you use in heifers. It's very effective if heifers are cycling, but it's also very effective if heifers are not yet cycling. And again, that opportunity to perform pre-breeding exams and vaccinations at seeder insertion. Also very effective with sex semen, particularly if using that split time AI protocol for how we actually manage the AI. So why do I encourage the 14-day seeder as opposed to some other options? Here's some data out of the Show Me Select program. This is just on-farm producer data. It's confounded 10 ways to Sunday, but these are real world results. If we look at how peripubertal heifers are doing across those three protocols, that left column, 33% on the 7-day co-sync plus seeder, that shorter 7-day protocol. Excuse me, 46% pregnant to fixed time AI, single service. These are heifers that had not yet reached puberty by the start of that protocol, right? So that's quite impressive to take a set of heifers and get 46% of non-cycling heifers to conceive after a 14-day seeder protocol. So that's part of that recommendation. But then you also see the very good fertility in the pubertal heifers as well. And actually, based on the number of animals in that would be statistically significant as well. 51 versus say 44. Again, you'll see that MGA prostaglandin protocol a little bit in between on the pubertal heifers. At least in terms of what it appears to be. There's no statistically significant difference there, but a valid approach if you're very cost conscious and want to avoid that cost of the seeder. Okay, so the use of estrus synchronization AI does not just result in premiums for heifers sold, it results in more early conceiving heifers to retain. I just want to make that point one last time. That has a lot of value for commercial producers that are retaining their own heifers, not just selling their own heifers, because the heifer that conceives in her first 21 days stays in the herd about 1.2 to 1.3 years longer on average, which means she weans 1.2 to 1.3 more calves over her lifetime. So I get to spread out her development costs over more calves. And then also she weans an older and heavier calf every single year, essentially adding an additional calf worth of weaning weight. So now I'm up to about 1.2 or 2.3 calves of additional weaning weight from that heifer that I get to spread that cost over. That's really economically important when we think about generating some gross margin in cows. Okay, a lot in that talk, I realize. Can I answer any questions about breeding strategies, or we can sure circle back to pre-breeding as well? Yes.
But I kind of want to focus a little more so on what a successful, heifer development diet might look like, and with particular interest in what a lot of producers that you might be working with or that you might be doing at home, what their diet's going to look like. So, okay, a couple of slides here on the front end. This is the nerd speak that the nutritionist has to get out of the way in the front end. So just bear with me for a second, okay? So when we formulate these diets, we assume that, a calf has unrestricted access to feed, that we're not doing some kind of limit feeding situation. And we use those targets basically then to develop nutrient concentrations that we need to hit to get a specific or targeted average daily gain. I pulled this table out of the Beef Cattle Nutrient Requirements textbook using a 550-pound beef calf. We'll set this table up for you. So there's 4 diets of varying TDN or energy concentrations. And you'll notice the TDN is from 65 to 80. The NEG is net energy for gain. That's another more accurate way of measuring energy concentration. I typically don't talk about it with cow-calf producers because TDN is expressed in pounds, and pounds of something seems to resonate with most audiences better than talking about megacalories or calories for that matter. However, when we compare grains and concentrates and forages all together in one, we're going to have a sharper pencil if we use NEG. But if you're more comfortable with TDN, that's A-OK as well. Now, the column on the right is the anticipated average daily gain that corresponds with the diet of those energy concentrations. Okay, and so the point I'm trying to make here, and I'm probably going to just come out and say it bluntly, is your hay is not as good as you think it is, and the hay that you're feeding to these cattle is creating you've got a long way to go in terms of picking up your supplement. So when we make hay as at our convenience and bale it in June and July rather than in when we harvest hay for maximum quantity rather than trying to think about quality, and we harvest low 50s TDN forage and then try to feed this to the growing animals, what we do is, we create the conditions where we're going to have to feed them more. We're going to have to provide them more supplement. Conversely, there's an opportunity that if you're taking advantage of baleage technology, if you're harvesting hay in May when you've got peak forage quality, it's possible to get closer to meeting that energy concentration and reduce your reliance on supplemental feedstuffs. It just because you'll be, a lot of high quality fescue baleage would be harvested somewhere in the neighborhood of 58 to 60 TDN. So the energy concentration that is put up here on the slide, those numbers are higher. If I'm working in the beef cow range of TDNs, I'm looking at trying to build a diet for a beef cow that's somewhere between 55 and low 60s TDN. So 55 is she's weaned a calf off and is just living life out in the pasture, not lactating, but pregnant, mid-gestation. Low 60s if she's 60 days post-calving at peak lactation. When we're working with these growing calves, we're looking at a higher plane of nutrition. So, no worries. The other thing to go along with this is how to predict feed intake and what an animal will voluntarily consume. So the columns across the top, DMI stands for dry matter intake. So that's when we take the water out of it. And for example, even dry grains, dry hay is going to be about 10% moisture. So typically if you multiplied all of these values by 1.1 for dry feedstuffs, that would be what it would be on an as-fed basis. These cattle are going to eat somewhere around 2.5% of their body weight. Y'all might have done those figuring for let's say stocking rate calculations for forage allocation calculations and used a number somewhat similar to that. The point of this is that, they're probably going to eat a little more than you think. And especially when you go into a heifer development program, if you fix intake at, let's say 15 pounds when you start it, the cattle are going to grow into that 15 pounds of intake, and they're going to grow beyond it. And so if you hold them at that rate over the entire development period, as they grow, their maintenance energy requirements go up to support that additional weight gain. And if your feed rate is not adjusted accordingly and doesn't go up with it, we're not going to keep pace with them. And so then we end up getting later on in the development period a scenario where we're almost limit feeding those animals. So like I said, I chose hay to use as kind of our backbone of our heifer development program here in Missouri, because time and again, the situation or operations that I've worked with, we're looking at utilizing a stored forage of some kind. So, and the reason for that is that, we have a highly productive and highly fertile pasture forage system in this state. It's quite frankly, it's like nothing else I've ever seen, especially coming from an area where we raised cattle on cholla cactus and mesquites, basically. So, but going along with that, we actually have a couple of forage gaps throughout the course of a calendar year that create some challenges in terms of allocating or budgeting feed to these cattle. If you think about fall calving heifers that are weaned in the spring, a majority of their development is going to occur during the months of the year where we would call the summer slump, where, seed heads have been developed in fescue. It's gotten hot. That fescue has gone dormant and senesced. We see quality drop. Filling that summer slump gap with quality feed, that presents a challenge. And the nice thing about that is that we develop, or we breed heifers onto really high quality forage. If we're breeding heifers in, let's say in December, those last 60 days prior to breeding, if they're on, fall regrowth of fescue, their diet quality is pretty good. Now, conversely, if we're talking about developing spring calving heifers, those heifers would be weaned in October-ish, and then they're going to graze stockpile for a little while until we run out of forage. And then they're going to be probably on hay over the winter, unless you have access to some cover crops or a winter annual, rye, triticale, wheat, etc. And then their breeding season is actually going to coincide with when, fescue really comes on in April, assuming that you're going to calve them in February. So we're just going to walk through this pasture or hay plus supplement scenario today. If you want to work through a TMR scenario, I would encourage you to give your local regional livestock specialist a call, or let me know, and I'm happy to help put together a TMR or a total mixed ration that you would be offering to heifers that are, say, developed in a dry lot. I just don't have time to go through them today. Okay, so now I want to basically say the same thing I've already said, but say it a different way. That's a tenet of effective communication, right, Dr. Payne? So TDN. The requirements of TDN to get, I'm sorry, I've got a typo. That should say 1.6 average daily gain, not 1.9. The TDN required to get your 1.6 average daily gain, which if you remember from the first presentation, we need to get the heifers to gain about 300 pounds in about 200 days. We need a TDN of 65. So if you'll put the next one up, here's the thing that we really kind of struggle with a little bit. I wish that we could have the consistency to say that everybody is putting up 55 TDN hay year in and year out in Missouri. But unfortunately, the quality of the forage is dependent upon so many factors that it is a literal, pardon my French, crapshoot as to what the quality of forage is that's put up in any given year. That makes it tremendously important that if you are investing significant resources in a heifer development enterprise, the analysis of that hay is tremendously important, because you'll notice that line is below our dotted line, which represents nutrient requirements. And unfortunately, I've encountered cases where a producer will bring in a hay test and say, I got my hay tested, let's build a ration to develop some heifers, and the hay will be 48 TDN. And they say, well, I put it up in June. It didn't get rained on. It was good quality hay ground. I fertilized. Everything went right, and the TDN was just atrocious. And so then when I told them that they needed to feed, more concentrate to help fill that energy gap, that nutrient gap, they questioned my sanity. So, hey, that happens all the time. I get it. No worries. But, you know, at the same time, with some diligent effort towards, you know, hay production practices, or, you know, maybe even trying to focus on grazing high quality forages rather than hay, we can shrink that gap and feed less. Now, the nice thing about even you know, a very standard 14% commodity mix that's a soy hull, corn, and gluten or distiller's grains or whatever protein source pellet, you know, the commodity mix that all the co-ops across the state offer, you know, typically in terms of TDN, they're going to come in. They don't put TDN on the label, but if you get them analyzed, they're going to come in the mid 80s in terms of TDN concentration. So it's a relatively energy dense feed stuff that we can backfill those backfill that deficit with. The question is, you know, especially now this year, how can we feed as little grain as possible and get by, because the commodity mix has gotten expensive. So what I would tell you when you're planning a feeding program, before you ever decide this is how many pounds of concentrate I'm going to feed, anything like that, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to price your feed stuffs that you're comparing per unit of energy, because that is the number one nutrient that you're trying to get into the diet to facilitate, you know, adequate heifer development. So I have 7 mixes across the screen right here, and I want to point out to y'all that you'll notice the rolled corn I have priced at $6.50 per bushel, which is just insane considering that corn is $4.80 right now. That number came from a producer in Southwest Missouri day before yesterday. That was an actual feed price that he received a quote to buy rolled corn. It came in at $11.62 a hundredweight, or 11, which corresponds to $6.50 a bushel. So we have soy hulls, gluten, distiller's grains, commodity mix, a 2 parts corn, 1 part dried distiller's grains mix that I created, or, you know, put up there for example. And then I also have another feed tag that came in from a producer yesterday that was a branded feed product. It was a commercially available protein pellet that was to be mixed with corn and then offered as a supplement, hand fed daily to growing cattle. And there were no drugs or any feed additives on board as well. It was just the product by itself. So how I did this price per pound of TDN is I simply took the price per pound and I divided it by the decimal form of TDN. And so you'll notice I got a range of anywhere from 14 cents per pound of TDN all the way up to 20 cents per pound of TDN. So that price of distiller's grain of 16 cents a pound is $320 a ton. Okay, so that's why the distiller's grains price is just that price is out of whack too, relative to what I'm seeing across the market. But again, that was what the producer was quoted at the co-op locally, so I have to use it as that I had to use it in the figuring. If you'll notice, the lowest price per pound of TDN is going to be corn, and it's going to be corn in most cases, just because corn has is tied for the greatest energy density of the diet with the distiller's grains. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at your commodity mix, you're going to come in at about 17 cents per pound of TDN. Your 2 parts corn, 1 part dried distiller's grain is 16.1 cents. Your branded feed product came in at 16.4 cents. And so, you know, and realistically, those are probably the 3 mixes that you would be looking at feeding, because if you put out just rolled corn with hay that's 8% crude protein, you've created a protein deficiency in that diet, because corn is 9% protein. The hay is 8% protein. Remember, our target threshold that we want to meet in terms of crude protein concentration in those diets is 12.5. Okay. So feeding rolled corn by itself is out. Soy hulls is between 10 and 12% crude protein. If your hay is good, soy hulls can work if you get them bought right, because if you'll notice, they're lower in TDN. And because they're lower in TDN, and at least right now, they're more expensive than corn, they don't make the best deal in terms of price per pound of TDN. Gluten's typically going to be used more as a protein source in a commodity pellet mix rather than an individual ingredient. It's going to be priced relatively similar to gluten right now. Again, I pointed out the distiller's grains price was high, and then we've got the other three. And so, really you're in pretty good shape in terms of, at least these prices up here, if you're choosing, either the 2 parts corn, 1 part dried distiller's grains, or, even the branded feed product came in very competitively. Am I allowed to say to my surprise? I did, so hopefully nobody's listening. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so the other way to look at this as well. So I also put up this price per pound of crude protein. If we're looking at a protein supplement to cows grazing low quality forage or eating low quality hay, this is the format I would use. I put it up here, even though crude protein is not the what I would be balancing this diet for. I'd be balancing it for energy. I still want to point out, like I said, that the poorer quality your hay is, the lower the crude protein concentration is. That brings into play the need to have a higher crude protein supplement to put out, because I've got to balance that so that I get to 12.5% crude protein in the total diet. Distiller's grains works great, but distiller's grains is a meal, and it's hard for a lot of people to handle. Now they're getting to where they're making distiller's grains as a 3/4 inch pellet or a range cube, but that product in particular is being priced for people out west who are using that as a protein supplement for cows in the winter. It is not price competitive. In fact, if you were going to get those pellets priced, I would expect them to be 20 to 30% higher than this quoted price right here, easily. Okay. Now, again, if I'm doing something on price per pound of crude protein, I'm always looking for the best deal there. Now, even though the distiller's grains are expensive because they're 30% protein, we get to a point where that is the cheapest per pound of crude protein. Great cow supplement, kind of hard to handle for a lot of folks. And also, again, we're not balancing for protein, we're balancing for energy in this case. So go ahead and go on to the next one. Now, how I would build these diets, okay, and so this actually is a question that I had in the in between sessions, is what's my framework for feeding cattle, for developing heifers, for growing animals if I'm going to provide them forage, free choice of some kind, whether that's grazing or whether that's hay, assuming that it's going to be low quality in both scenarios. If an animal is going to eat about 2.5% of their body weight per day in total diet, where I like to start out offering them about 40% of their diet come from my supplement and about 60% come from my forage. Okay. So what that looks like is essentially about 1 pound of a high energy supplement per 100 pounds of body weight for moderate quality hay. That's 40%. We take feedlot cattle and we put them on a 50% grain diet with no knowledge of their background or previous nutrition. Very safe level, not something you have to step them up to. If I had a 5-weight heifer, I would have no qualms taking her off pasture tomorrow, going and putting 5 pounds of grain in the bunk, assuming that she would eat it. I probably wouldn't do it because she probably didn't know how to use a bunk at that point. Then, I've got to train her how to use the bunk by putting a little hay in the bunk and then putting the feed on top. To get them used to it. But I have no concerns taking a weaned heifer and putting 5 pounds of grain out for them. Okay. Now, the reason that I like that number so much too, especially with a moderate quality hay, is if you look at the weighted average in terms of TDN, if your hay is, or your commodity mix is 85% TDN and it makes up 1/3 of the diet, and your hay's 55% TDN and it makes up 2/3 of the diet, you end up with an adjusted average of about 63% TDN in your diet. So it works out really well. The second thing that I really like about pinning your supplementation strategy to a percentage of body weight rather than giving a specific recommendation number of pounds is, as they get bigger, you feed them more to keep up for those maintenance energy requirement increases that occur as the animals continue to grow. So when they're 500 pounds, you feed them 5 pounds a day. When they're 600 pounds, you feed them 6. And that feeding recommendation grows with the animals. Okay. So now the last thing that came up, and this actually was my producer question yesterday that I was dealing with, is so feed is high and people are looking to cut costs. And I agree with them. I mean, it makes perfect sense. So I got an email the producer had a branded protein product, actually the product that was in the previous example. He sent me 2 labels, one with an ionophore, one without an ionophore. The one with the ionophore was, I believe, about $1.80 per 50-pound bag more expensive than the one without. And I think if you'll go to the next slide, I think the price is on there actually. Yeah, $1.30. I'm sorry, $2.30. That's worse. Oops. Okay. So an ionophore, what is an ionophore? So an ionophore is a feed additive that was released in about 1976. What it does is it is an antimicrobial, in that what it does is it goes into the cell wall of the microbes, and it disrupts the transfer of ions across that cell wall. Now, what that means then is that it selects against bacteria that have a permeable cell wall. Now, thankfully, in the rumen, the bacteria that have a permeable cell wall to ionophores are those that produce methane, that produce carbon dioxide, that don't produce productive things for us. And so it actually, to put it in kind of layman's terms, what an ionophore does is it basically kicks the lazy workers out and selects for the efficient workers. We get more energy per pound of feed that the animals consume when we have an ionophore on board. Now, sorry, if you'll go back, my bad. I didn't mean to give you the signal. In the branded product that the producer provided for me, the feeding recommendation was to mix it in a blend with corn. And the rate was that the producer was feeding was about 1.12 pounds of this protein pellet per head per day. Okay. Now, based on the difference in the price, the $2.30 per 50 pounds, he was spending about 5.152 cents per head per day on the ionophore. Now, the question is that cost justified? So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so ionophores they've been researched for a long time. There's a lot of data out there. So Larry Cora at Kansas State had a nice study back in the mid 80s looking at the impact of ionophores on a heifer development program. And what he did was he built a diet that was, the heifers were expected to gain 1.25 pounds per day on, and they were fed either the diet with or without the ionophore. Okay, so the control are the ones that were not fed an ionophore. The cattle performed to his ration formulation prediction very well. He predicted them to gain 1.25, they gained 1.24. The exact same diet with the ionophore added in, he predicted them to gain 1.25 pounds and they gained 1.44. That's a 15% improvement in average daily gain in this experiment due to the inclusion of an ionophore, because the two diets were exactly the same in terms of composition. The only difference was the inclusion or not of an ionophore. Additionally, what he saw, now I will point out that there were 120 heifers on this experiment, so about 60 per treatment. So not a big number that I would get real lathered up about the change in days to cyclicity, but there was the heifers that were fed the ionophore began to cycle 21 days earlier than the heifers that did not. So is it relevant? I would say that it's worth noting, but I don't know that it's relevant because it was such a small data set, on only 60 heifers. I don't feel good saying that's for sure going to happen every time, but I think it was interesting enough to bring up. Okay, if you go to the next one. So let's game out what adding an ionophore into your diet might look like. So if we're building a diet to gain 2 pounds a day without an ionophore on it, it's interesting that Dr. Cora saw 15% improvement in average daily gain, because the companies will run around and tell you that Rumensin and Bovitec, you're going to see about an 8.5% improvement in average daily gain in a growing animal diet when you add an ionophore in. So I'm going to be conservative. I'm going to use their number rather than what I saw in the literature. I also saw another paper that had a 15% improvement in average daily gain when using an ionophore, but I didn't put it up just for time's sake. So if we expect these animals to gain 8.5% more per day with the inclusion of an ionophore, that's going to be 2.17 pounds gain on an expected 2 pound average daily gain diet. And since we spent, that should be 5.152 cents per head per day, not 51 cents. If we spent 5 cents per head per day to gain an additional 0.17 pounds per day, our marginal cost of gain, so we spent for every, pound of weight gain that we got due to the inclusion of ionophore, we spent about 30 cents to get there. So from a cost of gain perspective, the ionophore is a slam dunk. So even though feed prices are high, I strongly encourage the use of, Rumensin, Bovatec, these ionophore products in these growing cattle diets, because quite frankly, the return on investment, it's there. So, okay, so that's about all I've got. Pretty simple framework. I'm happy to take any questions that y'all have, or I'll be around for the rest of the day as well if you want to visit individually. Thanks again for coming out. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to visit. So.
So historically, pregnancy diagnosis went from, I kind of got this from Dr. Matt Lucy. You could breed the cow and wait for her to calve, or you could wait and bump her. And this is in the dairy industry, bump her when she's 6 months or longer. And then it led to palpation. And then in the last 30 years, the ultrasound has become more popular. And then the most recent thing is blood or milk test. And we'll cover them all, but I'm going to concentrate on ultrasound. And the reason I'm going to concentrate on ultrasound is because from the Show Me Select program, the last data I had was about 91% of the pregnancy diagnoses are done with ultrasound now in the program. So it's overwhelmingly the modality we use for pregnancy diagnosis in the Show Me Select heifer program, and 9% are palpation. And another reason is and I, so I've been a veterinarian going to be 34 years, and I was in practice in Wisconsin and a dairy practice, and so I did a lot of palpating, done a lot. Really started more ultrasound 25 years ago, and I know in my hands, if I have ultrasound, I am more accurate than I am with my hand, even with doing lots and lots and lots of cows with my hand. And so one of the livestock specialists looks at the accuracy of palpating, or gets results from the prediction of when the pregnancies were and when they actually calve, and he plus or minus 10 days. And if it fits that window, then he calls that an accurate diagnosis. We all know that can vary a little bit. But from his data, and these are primary AI bred herds, or AI bred herds tend to be higher for their accuracy because you have known dates of breeding. If you looked here, roughly, and there's a lot of numbers here, almost 2,000 head, over 2,000 head. But the ultrasound in general, the ultrasound is more accurate under these circumstances than palpating. And once again, I've done a lot of palpating, and when I came out of practice, I felt I was pretty good, but the ultrasound makes me better. And here are just the comparison of the different modalities out there right now. How early can you use them? If you're going to do palpation, you're going to do down to 30 days. You got to be doing a lot of probably dairy work because you're going to have that chance. Ultrasound, you can go a little earlier. The blood test is 25 to 28 days, milk 35. And then compare, can you tell if the embryo is alive or not? Only the ultrasound can tell you that. If you want to do some fetal sexing between 57, 60 days and 100 days, only the ultrasound tells you that.
100 days. That's key.
Mm-hmm.
The cow side palpation ultrasound or cow side, the blood milk, there is a 30-minute blood test, but it's not cow side. Can't get the cow to just do the test right there by her and to make the decision. And of course, days postpartum, because the blood and milk relies on pregnancy-associated glycoprotein or placental-associated glycoproteins, because from when she's pregnant with the last calf, that peg has half-lives and it can extend out far enough that if you breed a cow really early, and it's potential that could interfere with your test. So anyways, so those are little details on the different modalities. So palpation, once again, and we mentioned this in the previous one, someone asked why 90 days after the start of the breeding season, and it helps with the accuracy. And it really, palpation, whichever modality you choose, the accuracy is going to be greater if it's done early in the pregnancy. Of course, palpation, signs of pregnancy, size difference between the horns, fluid in the uterine horn, presence of a calf or embryo, membrane slip, placentomes, uterine arteries. We can use all these modalities and these different signs to determine if a cow is pregnant or not with palpation. Just a chart to look at how do you determine the gestational age, by using either the amniotic vesicle, the size of the uterus, the calf size, or placentomes or uterine artery. So ultrasound, once again, if you're going to the MV, or you've signed up for the MVMA meeting, I've got 2 hours on this this year. You can go into more details, but basically ultrasound became, first studies came out of in the 1980s. There's different probe, the different megahertz of the probes, 3.5 to 7.5 are most common. Most common is a 5 megahertz probe. It's probably the most useful for different fetal sexing, early pregnancies and such. On this picture here, the black is fluid, so that doesn't reflect back, and therefore it looks black, whereas tissue reflects back the ultrasound and has these shades of gray in it. And I've taught a lot of students. Really, I've had farmers watch me ultrasound and watch the picture, and they can pick up some things. But really, the art of using the ultrasound is getting the picture, and it just takes time to figure out how to get the picture you want to be able to get the information you need. So ultrasound, some of the advantages, it's a little earlier pregnancy diagnosis is possible. You can determine once again if the embryo, the fetus is alive. It reduces the false negatives and false positives. There's some data that would suggest if you palpate early, down to 30 days or so, that you could cause some atresia, rectal atresia or intestinal atresia. And with the ultrasound, you don't do that. And of course, fetal sexing is possible only with the ultrasound. Here's one thing that you could confuse a pregnancy with without the ultrasound is a pyometra. And this is what it looks like. I always see if you actually see it in moving, that the pus in that pyometra almost looks like a snowstorm. I always say it looks like a snowstorm, but because it's going to feel like it has fluid, and because the uterus is probably going to be enlarged, it's possible with palpation to misdiagnose as a pregnancy, whereas the ultrasound, you won't do that. One of the things that helps with the ultrasound too is defining the ovarian structure. So this here is the corpus luteum, okay? Now, one of research has shown one of the things, even experienced palpators, sometimes we don't always pick up all the corpus luteum, whereas with the ultrasound, you know, we can see that on the ultrasound. There it is. Oh, and there's a follicle. Got that one backwards. Once again, the follicle is going to have fluid in it, and therefore it's going to be black. And here's ovarian cyst. Once again, it's going to have fluid, and you can tell. This screen, I can tell, is 5 centimeters across. Okay, I don't have a grid here, but it's 5 centimeters, and so this is ovarian cyst, 5 centimeter. I saw one of these the other day with Dr. Volkman. And of course, here we can see the actual embryo. Here it is, with the amnion around it. And so this is about a 35-day embryo. And of course, if I had a video of this, we could actually see the beating hearts, tell the viability. Once again, the ultrasound, fetal aging, most accurate early, 30 to 90 days, determine the fetal viability. You know, is this calf alive? And determining the gestational age early before 55 days of gestational age, I use a crown to rump length. So from the crown of the head to the rump of the calf, and you can determine how long that is with this. And so a 1 centimeter embryo is roughly about 35 days of gestation. Whereas once you get beyond 55 days, it's hard to get the whole calf in one picture. And so you can use a crown to nose. And 2 centimeter here, crown to nose, is a little over 60 days of gestation. So early on is crown to rump. After 55 days, 60 days, then we use crown to nose. You can use other things as well, but these are ways you can get a picture to really kind of get an idea of what the gestational age is. Once again, here I've got a summary. Once again, early, I'm using crown to rump, and afterwards about head length, so crown to nose. Fetal sexing, the earliest you can do is about 57 days of gestation. And the reason for that is what we're looking for is the genital tubercle. And the genital tubercle migrates. So it starts off between the legs of the calf. And then if it's a female, it migrates to the tail. And if it's a male, it migrates to the umbilical cord. Okay. And so gestationally, it takes that long to get into position, and it takes a little longer for the female to get to its position than the male. So you can't go much earlier than this to be able to fetal sex. About the latest really depends on where that uterus is in, how long it stays up in the pelvis. Once it falls over the cranial edge of the pelvis, it becomes harder to be able to tell the sex. I always tell students, the umbilical cord is your landmark. You have to find the umbilical cord and you have to follow it in, because the male genital tubercle is immediately caudal to the umbilical cord, okay? So therefore, when you're doing this, you always got to keep in mind what's cranial, what's caudal, what's ventral, what's dorsal. I tell students, you really have to be anticipating where you're going. If you wait to get to where you're going to be looking, you will miss things. You have to be anticipating. So you have to know where cranial and caudal is. You have to know ventral dorsal, all right? We're looking, and the male and female tubercles look alike. You tell them the difference is by their location, okay? They don't look different, they look the same. It's just by location. Female is below the tail, which makes it somewhat hard to see it. And the male is just caudal to the umbilical cord. These secondary structures can be used too. About day 75 to 80, the scrotum will appear, and day 75, 80, you can begin to see teats. Now you got to be careful because we all know bulls have teats as well. Okay, so you got to be careful that even if you see teats, make sure you don't see scrotum in male. All right. And right here I show this is the umbilical cord. This is the thighs. Okay, back legs, and here is scrotum, and here is the male genital tubercle. So it is immediately caudal to the umbilical cord, and of course scrotum is back there between the legs, and this is, this is different than the female. Once again, this is cranial, this is caudal, but here is the female genital tubercle, and here is the tail. Okay, female and tail. Just one last slide on the pregnancy-associated or placental-associated glycoproteins. The blood or milk test can be done as early as 25 days after breeding. Most companies state 28 days. Cow has to be more than 2 to 3 months from the last calving because you can have some leftover pegs. There is, like I mentioned, a 30-minute that you can run on the farm. I show this because once again, it does not tell you if the embryo is alive. This is an example of a cow who got pregnant. You can see it getting bluer, was pregnant at day 33 of gestation, then went ahead and lost it. Okay, lost the pregnancy, so it's becoming lighter, came back in heat, was AI'd again. And then once again, about day 26, it starts showing up more bluer color. So she's pregnant. And this time around, she maintained the pregnancy. You could see how it stayed darker blue. But once again, the limiting here is you will get some false positives. And so the difference between ultrasound and this is that you could get some false positives because it's not telling you that this calf was alive or not. It's still there. So, and with that, I went fairly quick, but does someone have questions?
So, yeah, next slide. So again, just EPD's work. Next slide. Again, relatedness, we have to have that. The difference here is instead of using pedigree information, we're now using DNA information to measure relatedness. Because pedigrees, we use averages. With DNA, we actually measure specifically the genetic similarity. When we do that more accurately, when we measure the genetic similarity more accurately, the genetic prediction also becomes more accurate. Again, this is kind of a visual of a traditional EPD. Next. From 2010 to about 2015, this is how we did genomic enhanced EPDs. The genomic test result was kind of a fourth piece of information that was fed into the genetic prediction. Next. So then what we transition to is we combine the pedigree information and the genomic information together to measure that genetic similarity. Here's a quick toy example, 2 flushmate bulls, both the exact same pedigrees. Based on pedigree, we would say each bull shared 25% of their DNA with each of the 4 grandparents. When we DNA test all 8 animals in this pedigree, we can actually measure the genetic similarity based on the genes and chromosomes that were passed on at each generation of this pedigree. And so what we can see is the high-ranking flushmate bull, he shares 35% of his DNA with the high-ranking paternal grandsire there in black. The low-ranking flushmate bull shares 32% of his DNA with the low-ranking maternal grandam there on the top right. Okay, so by looking at the DNA and measuring the genetic similarity more accurately, the DNA prediction becomes more accurate. Here's just another way to look at that same thing. We've got the animal, we've got the parents and the grandparents based on pedigree, 25% relatedness. We go ahead and DNA test everyone. Next slide. Those numbers change off of 25%. We get those relatedness numbers more accurate, the EPD becomes more accurate. Next. Genetic and genomic predictions work. We have what's called a preprint posted on the web. So if you just Google that, you'll be able to pull it up, read this paper. We'll briefly go through some of the results. Next. So this is data from 781 calves from 231 cows at the Thompson Research Center. All of the cows are tested with the Zoetis GeneMax Advantage test. So here we're comparing the dam's GeneMax carcass weight score versus the calf's actual carcass weight. And there is a strong relationship in terms of statistics, in terms of that relationship. So each 1 point improvement in the GeneMax score is 0.4 of a pound improvement in the calf's carcass weight. We can do that same thing for weaning weight, and we see the same thing. As the GeneMax scores go up, the weaning weight goes up as well. Now, one of the things that I'll point out here is we have this line, but we still have a lot of spread around that line. That spread is related to all of the randomness that we deal with in biology. So it's the random shuffle of genes and chromosomes between generations. It's interactions between genetics and environment. It's different environmental stressors that those various animals have. So at each of those points, there's basically a bell curve where we see a lot of animals, a lot of progeny close to that line, and we've got some outliers that are further away from that line. Next. Let's go next. So basically what we expect to see is for every 1 point improvement in the EPD, we see a 1 pound improvement in the performance of the offspring. And so if we look at about 24 or so sires that were frequently used at Thompson Research Center, we see that trend. There's kind of 3 bulls that don't line up on that line in that gray shaded area. 2 of those bulls at the 45 pound weaning weight, they were unproven bulls that did not have DNA test. And so what that's saying is that low accuracy EPD did not do a good job of predicting their performance. The bull there at about 65 pounds weaning weight, who's up there high on the top right, that's Hoover Dam, raised in fescue, and so perhaps are his progeny performing better than expected because they're well adapted to the environment. Next. So if we look at trends over time, all of these traits are increasing. Weaning weight is increasing. Next. Birth weight is decreasing because we've been selecting for more calving ease. Next. Marbling is increasing. Next. Carcass weight is increasing. Next. All of this is showing that as you consistently use these tools, you'll see the performance of your herd change. Next. So when do you use genomics? For commercial producers, the easiest way to use genomics is to simply buy bulls that have genomic enhanced EPDs. And I encourage commercial producers to never buy a bull unless it has genomic enhanced EPDs. Why do I say that? The genomic data is going to increase the EPD accuracy, okay? It's going to identify differences between flush mates. So are you buying the best bull of the flush or the worst bull of the flush? The other thing it does is the DNA test provides the same amount of information as if we had 10 to 20 calves out of that bull. So you can go buy a yearling bull, and it's as if you have the first calf crop back on that bull. But not only do you have the first calf crop back, but you have all of the data back on that first calf crop. So the heifer pregnancy data, the marbling data, the carcass weight, growth, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, it reduces your risk of making an unlucky decision. Like we're talking about, whenever we're dealing with the genetics, we're dealing with randomness. By having the DNA test, it's reducing your risk that the true genetic potential is different from the reported estimated genetic potential. The uncertainty in the number you're looking at is going to be smaller, and so your opportunity of making an unlucky purchasing decision is going to be reduced, which is going to allow you to make more money and make better decisions next. There's also opportunities in commercial settings to DNA test commercial heifers. The key here is if you're going to DNA test commercial heifers, you have to use that information to make a decision. If you're going to keep 20 replacement heifers and you DNA test 20 heifers, you've not used that DNA information to make a decision. So you have to DNA test many more heifers than you plan to keep. If you need to keep 20 heifers, you need to DNA test 40 heifers and use the DNA test results to help you pick the 20 best out of those 40. It's important that you pick the right test. If you're working with registered cattle, use the DNA test from the breed association. If you're working with commercial straight bred cattle, try to use a DNA test designed for that breed. So if you have straight bred commercial Angus, you would use a DNA test designed for commercial Angus. If you have straight bred red Angus, you design a DNA test used for them. If you've got Gelbvieh balancer commercial cattle, you'd use a DNA test designed for them. If you don't have a breed specific test, then there are a crossbreed, multiple breed DNA tests designed that work well. Next. Okay, so if you're going to invest this money in genomics, how are you going to see a return on that investment? So these are various premiums that we see in the Show Me Select program. We see about $66 for sire identified heifers that are out of proven AI sires. We see about a $100 premium if she's carrying an artificial insemination pregnancy, etc. Next slide. If she has a DNA test result, we see about $150 premium. So the Show Me Select producers in this early data from 2008 to 2017 were paying a premium for that additional information for those heifers that have genomic data. The other thing that you can do is you can DNA test a set of females to try to help make replacement decisions. But the DNA test results on those females tells you the DNA, the genetic merit, the average genetic merit of their steer mates. And so there's programs set up, there's programs available that you can DNA test either your entire heifer crop or a random sample of your heifer crop and use that information to more aggressively market the steer mates. So these are some of those programs that are out there, Angus League, Top Dollar Angus, etc. But if you're going to invest in DNA testing commercial females, you need to identify some way to more aggressively market their calves, okay? Hopefully what you're doing with that DNA test information is creating a higher quality product, and hopefully you can get paid a premium for that higher quality calf crop. Next. We've got a USDA project that's funded that's taking various data points that we collect in the Show Me Select program. So the reproductive tract scores that we've talked about, the pelvic measurements, and the 90-day ultrasound data, and using that data to better predict genetic merit for heifer puberty and heifer fertility. So if you have red Angus or Hereford heifers, get in touch with me or Jordan Thomas for how you can participate in this research project and get free genomic enhanced EPDs by sharing that reproduction data with us. Next. So with that wraps it up with me. Really quickly, you know, all of us carry these cell phones around in our pockets, right? And if you've heard me talk before, you've heard me give this analogy, but none of us actually know how a cell phone works, right? If I challenged you, nobody could come up here and explain how the signal goes from my phone to a tower to some other tower and gets translated and all of that. We don't actually know how it works. What we know is that it does work. The various technologies, the various practices, management strategies that the four of us have talked with you about today, they work. They've been proven time and time again. You don't need to know how they work. You need to identify how you can use them on your operation to be more profitable. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or cut you guys loose because it's been a long afternoon.